Good morning. It's good to see all your smiling faces this morning. It's a beautiful day. I think it's coming to an end soon. Monday, I think, is supposed to rain. Monday and Tuesday is supposed to storm. All right, we're starting in verse 47 of Luke chapter 22. We're in the betrayal of Jesus. Question 2. We'll go ahead and read 47. He was still speaking. Behold, a multitude came. And if you look at the other accounts of this, you'll see how great this multitude was. Matthew, or Luke calls it a multitude. Matthew calls it a great multitude. And then John talks about there being a cohort. And how many troops make up a cohort? You've got 600. 600 men. So these are the Roman soldiers, along with the Jewish temple guard and those that would be. So you've got a great multitude here. You've got upwards close to 1,000 people that are coming to arrest one man. And I think we'll get a glimpse as to why that takes place in today's lesson. But behold, while he was speaking, behold, a multitude came, and one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding them and approaching Jesus to kiss him. And Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him or the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, stop, no more of this. And he touched his right ear and healed him. And Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and the elders who had come against him, have you come out with swords and clubs as against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this hour and the power of darkness are yours. All right. Why was Jesus betrayed with a kiss? Why did Judas betray Jesus with a kiss?
Because that was a sign that he could tell them that he would get it, wasn't it?
Yeah. From a logical viewpoint. Say again? Yeah. It was at night to identify. But why the kiss? Definitely to identify him as...
Wait, was it prophecy? Was it prophesied?
Well, it was. But the interesting part about a kiss is it is a sign of affection. So you've got Judas coming as a betrayer, giving the sign of a betrayer with a kiss. And it really strikes me anyway, that this betrayer is showing the betrayer sign. It's doubtless that Judas sought to conceal his guile with this act of affection. But this had to have really hit Judas hard when Jesus responds back to him the way he did. And betrayest thou? Are you betraying? I have been with you for 3.5 years. I have taught with you, and you're betraying me? Yes, Wade.
No, I was just saying that I would think that a kiss would have been something that would have been common, and it wouldn't set alarm in the other disciples. And so, for Judas to betray him that way, if he thought that the other disciples would rise up or they would run, you know, if he just pointed him out and said, hey, that's the man, and then, you know, just a kiss, they could have come up on him and not stirred up the alarm.
Yeah, yeah. There was a lot of people there at that time. They could have taken him by force, and eventually they did. But the interesting thing about Judas's response, and yeah, it was a common sign of affection toward people. Jesus, betrayest thou me, the Son of Man? And the Son of Man was a typical expression of the Messiah, who was the Savior of the world. And you're betraying the Son of Man with this sign of affection, with this kiss. The obligations of fidelity to the Lord that he had known for 3.5 years and had been with him for 3.5 years. And you have to see, as this whole situation evolves with Judas, just how emotional this aspect was for him, this time was for him, as well as it was for Jesus. And we saw the emotion last week in Jesus as he came to the Garden of Gethsemane. But are you betraying the hope of the world, the hope of the nations, with this sign of affection? And what response did Jesus give to the chief priests, the captains of the temple guards, and the elders? Jesus responded to Judas. Now how does he respond to the temple guard and the elders? And yes, sir.
He asked him, he said, if you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, I was in the temple every day and you didn't do anything.
Yeah, exactly. Who do you think you're coming up against? Are you coming up against a robber? Are you coming up against... I've been with you. I've been teaching all of this time in the temple, especially during this last week. He's been teaching every day in the temple. And had they come and... Why did they not come and arrest him while he was teaching in the temple? Yeah, fear of the people. And it wasn't his time. You know, Jesus picked the right time and said the exact right words that would just set off the Jewish leadership, as we're getting ready to see him do. And it was those words that really propelled them to say, okay, you're a dead man now. Although they had wanted him dead for fear of the people, they were not able to take him when they wanted him. They've been trying to take him for some time now. Yes, ma'am. Sarah?
Jesus wasn't surprised that Judas betrayed him.
Right.
John said that he knew from the beginning that he was the one that was betraying him. And I think the amazing thing is that he was able to treat him the same all those 3 years, even though he knew
Yeah.
he didn't believe him that he was going to betray him.
Yeah, and Jesus at the Passover feast very obviously pointed out who it was that was going to betray him. So Jesus knew exactly who it was. This wasn't a surprise to him. But I think these words were chosen by the Lord to penetrate deeply into the heart of Judas. Yes, sir.
What they weren't expecting is they weren't expecting him to come fight.
Yeah.
They weren't expecting him to know that this was all planned and that he knew that he was supposed to die. That's not what they expected. They expected that they would have to physically restrain him and carry him in.
Yeah.
So I think that just boggled their minds. Of course, we're going to talk about some of the events that happened here, but I just think that some of those people that were there, you ever wonder too if some of those people there ever converted just because of the incidents that they did.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the fact that Jesus said, well, who are you looking for? He said, I am he. Let these others go. Yes, ma'am. And then Tom. Women first. Yeah. She was probably patting your legs. Ask this question.
I always find it interesting. It just shows how blind people are when they have an agenda. Jesus,
Yeah.
heals the ear of somebody cut, I think it was Peter, cut off the right ear of the slave of the high priest. And even seeing that miracle,
Yeah.
they still went forward with their agenda. And they just It was as though they didn't say, oh, that,
Yeah.
and maybe we should believe in him.
And they couldn't see the servant of the high priest's ear being healed miraculously. Tom and then J.D.
Just well, the number of people that had come out, almost like they expected to be a lot more there, even though, Judas knew
Yeah.
Jesus' habitual plan was when he was in Jerusalem to go in out to the Mount of Olives with the 12. But the 12 would not have been a match for that large
Yeah,
number of
yeah.
people.
But I do think they were expecting greater than what they got. And we'll see that as this lesson progresses. J.D.?
Yeah, I was having the same thought that Karen was, and it always makes me think of, the rich man and Lazarus, about how the rich man wanted Abraham to send back him from the dead so he could tell his brothers the truth and that they needed to do right. And he was told that, if they wouldn't believe Moses and the prophets, they wouldn't believe even if a person rose from the dead.
Yeah.
It's the same thing here. They had made their hearts so hard against Jesus, it seems like, even though they just witnessed him do a miracle, then it didn't faze them at all.
Yeah, it's kind of funny what Herod wanted to see Jesus performed while he was being arrested. And, but, okay, any further questions or comments? And we'll get to this, the expectation of what the Romans expected with the arrest of Jesus because of what the charges were against him. And we'll see those charges in just a few minutes. Any further questions or comments about this section before we go into part G? Yes?
Peter that cut off the servant's ear.
Yeah, it was. He was identified in the other Gospels. Say again? Yeah, Luke gives us kind of the cliff notes of this all that's taking place. And we'll see, again, the shortened version of Luke's account as we get into the trial and the arrest and the trial. In verses 54, and we'll go ahead and read 54 through 23 and chapter 23 and verse 25. And having arrested him, they led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest. But Peter was following at a distance. And after they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter was sitting among them. And a certain servant girl came saying, as he sat in the firelight, and looked intently at him and said, "This man was with him too." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later, another saw him and said, "You are one of them too." And Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after about an hour had passed, another man began to accuse him, saying, "Certainly this man also is with him, for he is a Galilean too." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, a cock crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the words of the Lord, how he had told him, "Before a cock crows today, you shall deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. And the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, "Prophesy, who is it that hit you?" And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. And when it was day, the council of the elders and the people assembled, both chief priests and the scribes, and they led him away to the council chambers and said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And that guiled them. And they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." And then the whole body of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King." And Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And he said to them, he answered him and said, "It is as you say." And Pilate said to the chief priests and the multitude, "I find no guilt in this man." And they kept on insisting, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee even to this place, Jerusalem. And when Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he heard that he had belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was also in Jerusalem at this time. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he wanted to see him for a long time because he had been hearing about him and he'd been hoping to see some sign or some miraculous sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod, with his soldiers after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they were at enmity with each other. And Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, "Ye brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, I have examined him before you, and I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you've made against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish him and release him." Now he was obligated to release, parenthetically it's stated, he was obligated to release to them at the feast one prisoner. And they cried out all together, saying, "Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas." For he was one who had been thrown into prison for a certain insurrection made in the city and for murder. And Pilate wanted to release Jesus, answered them again. But they kept on calling out, saying, "Crucify, crucify him." And he said to them the third time, "Why, what evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding a death. And I will therefore punish him and release him." But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced sentence at their demand, that their demand should be given. And he released the man they had asked for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but they delivered Jesus to their will. Where was Jesus taken after he was arrested? Where was he taken? House of the high priest. Who is the high priest? Caiaphas? Yes, sir.
Annas and Caiaphas.
Yeah. I think that's the exact right answer. Annas and Caiaphas. Tom, did you have a... Okay. They took Jesus, Luke says they took Jesus to the house of Caiaphas, who was the high priest. But Luke omits the trial before Annas. And John 18 gives us the information of that trial before Annas. I think Luke just responds to it very, just as kind of where the soldiers were mocking him. I don't see it off the top of my head. Where they said, "Prophesy," slapped him, said, "Prophesy, who hit you?" 63. Okay. Yeah. Blind, okay. I think this is a reference, a 1 or 2 verse reference to what happened in John 18. And in John 18, Jesus is first taken to Annas. Look at John 18, verses 12 through 24. So the Roman cohort and the commander of the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, and they led him to Annas first. For he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. Simon Peter was following Jesus, and so was another disciple. I think that other disciple is John. As we look through the Gospel of John, I think we see that's the case. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known by the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. He had some clout with these people. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." And now the slaves and the officers who were standing there had made a charcoal fire, and it was cold, and they were warming themselves, and Peter was also among them, standing and warming himself. And the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogue and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and I spake nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They will know what I said." Then when he had said this, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus, saying, "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" And Jesus answered, "If I had spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong, but if rightly, why do you strike me?" So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. It's interesting that Luke chapter 3 says, "in the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas." So it appears that then the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. Annas is mentioned before Caiaphas every time the two are mentioned together. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 6, when Peter and John were arrested and brought to the high priest with the Sanhedrin, Annas and Caiaphas. Annas is mentioned first. While Caiaphas, as John said, was the actual high priest, Annas was certainly the ruling spirit of the priesthood. And the reason given for Jesus going to Annas first was that he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. From history, from Josephus, we learned that Annas was high priest from the year 7 to 15. So he had been a high priest for some time. And he had 5 sons who also served as high priest. So we kind of look at this, the priesthood of Annas, the dynasty of Annas as far as the priesthood is concerned. And so Annas was, especially as far as the Jewish leadership was concerned, a very important voice for the people. And it is believed that Annas, and ISBE brings this out, that Annas lived in the same palace. He had an apartment in the palace there where Caiaphas lived. And then they were led from the Annas to Caiaphas, and then they were taken to this hall where the Sanhedrin could meet together. I'm not sure Caiaphas had a house big enough for the Sanhedrin, but 24 members of the Sanhedrin, but they came and into another hall. And Peter was not allowed in, by John's account. Peter was not allowed in first. So John went out, spoke to the gatekeeper, who is the security guard there, and said, "It's okay, I know the guy, bring him in." And he brought him in. And he followed her at a distance and warmed himself by a charcoal fire. John 18:18 bears this out as well, that the charcoal fire was there. This charcoal fire will become very important in John chapter 21, where the disciples and Peter is around another charcoal fire. And the resurrected Lord came to Peter, and 3 times, remember Peter denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus asked Peter 3 times by a charcoal fire, "Do you love me?" And that would have brought back this flood of emotion as they were in the same setting as he had betrayed the Lord. And it is the first thing that happens is, what was our question again? What happened in the courtyard? Did I ask that question? No, what happened in the courtyard? I kind of gave the lead up to it. What happened in the courtyard? Yeah, Peter denies the Lord 3 times. I was struck by Luke's account because Luke you know, I always looked at it as, well, you know, bam, bam, bam. 1, 2, 3, they came up to and asked Peter if he knew him, and he said, no. Never heard of the man. Don't know who you're talking about. But the account that's given here shows the length of time that it took for these 3 denials of Peter. A servant girl identified Peter by the firelight as he was standing there warming himself and said, this man was with Jesus too. And he denied, man, I don't know who you're talking. I don't know him. Never heard of the guy. Who? And then a little later, doesn't say how long later, but enough to say a little later, another man saw him, and you were with him too. And Peter again said, man, I am not. Very definitively. And then it says about an hour later, another man insisted that Peter was with him because his speech gave him away. You know, this guy's a Galilean too. You don't have, how many Galileans you have coming into this area? And this man was with him too. And he says, man, I don't know what you're talking about. By this firelight. And when you get a chance, read John 21. As Jesus, I've got a lesson that is entitled, Jesus Restores a Broken Spirit. And the broken spirit of Peter was very obvious as he went out and wept bitterly. And in John 21, Jesus comes to him in that same setting of the firelight, of this charcoal fire, and says, do you love me? Do you love me? Tend my sheep. Tend my sheep. Yes, Tom.
You know, the importance of that gatekeeper. You know, one, the Roman soldiers wouldn't have been allowed into this area, so the gatekeeper was responsible
Right.
for keeping them out. If there
It
were
would
any
have defiled them.
sympathizers to Jesus,
Yeah.
he was there to keep them out. When Jesus came and brought Peter in, had to have permission. The gatekeeper allowed it to come in. So,
Yeah.
you know, we have a gatekeeper there in that situation that has some important duties. Because if word had gotten out to the common people here at this time, there wouldn't have been a trial. There would have been an
Yeah.
uprising and all this other things.
Yeah.
And that could be the reason for these Roman soldiers to...
Yeah, I think it was. And we already read the charges that the chief priests and the scribes brought before, the 3 charges, and we'll look at those. And there are 3 capital offenses under the Roman law. And so Rome really, at least these guards, I'm not sure Pilate knew about this, but certainly the commander of the cohort would have. He said, we're going to nip this in the bud, as Barney Fife would say. We're going to nip this in the bud. We're going to bring out 600 soldiers, and we're going to make sure nothing happens. And we'll see that in a few minutes. But yeah, I think yeah.
Also the importance there that the temple guards were also there along with it. They had a certain deal. And with the high priest, that'd be sort of like the security detail for the high priest.
Yeah,
like,
and the elders.
and the elders.
Yeah.
Like, you know, Rome has their own security guards for the Pope to allow nobody to get to him to, you know, for assassination or anything like that. So, you know, it's sort of the same thing. Any important dignitary would have had taken certain security precautions. And if you're going to plot something, you want to keep it sort of secret and not let people know that might cause you problems.
Yeah. So the Roman cohort was there to prevent an uprising because Jesus was very popular among the people. I mean, so they were there to prevent the uprising and then to escort him to Annas, and then they would take off. They would no longer have jurisdiction there in the temple area. So they would take him to Annas. Annas questioned him and then sends him to Caiaphas. And during this time, this event with Peter takes place as we're looking at this. And who are the ones who treated Jesus with contempt in verses 63 through 65? Who are the ones? Yes.
They would have been the temple guard and the people like that at this location. That's who would have been there. And so the ones who should have been looking forward to him most anxious that this Messiah coming was the ones who were treating him the worst.
It would have included the temple guard. You're absolutely right. Yeah. But I think there's more in this as well. Yes, sir.
Sir, I was still stuck on Peter. So,
Yeah.
So I think we always give Peter a hard time. He's a hothead, quick to speak, but also, you read through this, he's the protected type. All the rest of them fled, and him and John.
Yeah.
You can kind of see him sneaking along behind with this sword, like, I've got to help Jesus. And it's just a very compassionate type of person.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this was a highly emotional time, not only for the disciples, and Jesus had been preparing them for this. In John 14 through 16, you see how Jesus was preparing his disciples for his departure. And he was promising them the Holy Spirit, and when the Holy Spirit comes, he would be the comforter, and he would guide them in all truth. He had many things that he wanted to tell them, but the comfort, the Holy Spirit, would guide them in all truth and bring to him his teachings. And so it was a very highly charged event for everybody involved. The Roman soldiers would have been highly on their guard, expecting a rebellion. The chief priests and the scribes and the Sanhedrin all wanted to kill Jesus, so it would have been a highly charged event for them. The disciples, certainly a highly charged event for them. Jesus had been presenting to them that he was going to be put to death, and they were seeing it unfold. Yes.
Back to the rest, when Peter rose up and cut off the ear, and Jesus said stop. When you look at the New American Standard, there's punctuation in there. There's an exclamation mark.
Yeah.
It was very dramatic, and in doing so, he's preserving his disciples, because if that would have continued, the Roman soldiers would have come in. The remaining 12, the 11 would have been evidently killed, and nothing carried on. So Jesus, in telling them to stop, preserves them so that they can go through and do their work later on, which he'd already planned on.
Yeah, exactly. Now, getting back to this, getting off Peter, and back to this question, who are the ones who treated Jesus with contempt? Looking at verses 63 through 65, you don't see a lot of interaction here. Who is there? The men who are holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him. Who was holding him in custody? It depends on when you're talking about. There were 3 basic trials. Some even count there were 6 trials. The trial before Annas, the trial before Caiaphas that night, and then the next morning, the trial before Caiaphas again. And then he sends him over to Pilate. I don't know how many fingers I've got up. But he sends him to Pilate, and Pilate sends him to Herod, and then Herod sends him back to Pilate. And so all 3 of those Roman trials are considered as separate events. And then the 3 trials of the Jews were considered by some as separate events. So typically we look at 3 basic trials that Jesus was going through all night long, Thursday night all the way through Friday morning. But if you look at Luke 18, what we read just a few minutes ago, we see that Jesus was before the council. Now, I'm not sure this is the whole council, because it's the middle of the night and they're getting the members together. They may have gotten them together planning this event all along, I'm not sure, but certainly they were getting the Sanhedrin together. And some of them, because it says the elders of the people were out there with the cohort, John 18 says. And so the cohort comes to Caiaphas, dumps him off, and then the temple guard would have still been there, as well as the members of the Sanhedrin. I think it probably included members of the Sanhedrin as well, who were mocking him and spitting on him, the ones who were supposed to be judging him fairly. And because verse 63 or 64 and 65 seems to imply that's the time when Jesus was before Annas. The men who were in custody mocking him and beating him, blindfolding him, saying, "Prophesy, who hit you?" That's exactly what happened in John 18, unless it happened more than once, and it could well have. So the ones who were not only the temple guard, but also the elders of the people, I think were part of that group that was treating him with contempt. and then brought before Annas and then brought before Caiaphas, what did the Jewish council charge Jesus with? In question 5.
Perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes.
Yeah.
Son of God.
Yeah, they accused him of 3 capital offenses. Notice there's an and between every one of those. It would be misleading the nation, causing a dangerous agitation among the people. And the emperor wanted and demanded peace. And as other rebellions had taken place and were put down, this rebellion was to be put down as well. And that's why I think the cohort was there to arrest Jesus, because they were expecting this rebellion. Tom?
Look at that council. All the members of the council weren't there. If you go later on, Luke 23 talks about Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus.
And Nicodemus, right?
So, at least those two.
They were conveniently left out. I wonder why.
So, they're evidently taking a poll of who they wanted there.
Yeah. Hey, stick your finger in there. Yeah. Those 2 members were members of the council, members of the Sanhedrin, who were not consenting to Jesus' death. And so they were eliminated from the final decision anyway, as the Sanhedrin unanimously decided to put him to death. And we'll see that in just a few minutes if we have time, if not next week. So the first charge, he's misleading the people, causing a rebellion. The second charge, he forbids the paying of taxes to Caesar. Did Jesus teach that? Just the opposite, right, Matt? Yeah, just the opposite of that. But it's an important charge, because if this rebellion could actually take place, and if the nation could be convinced not to pay taxes to Caesar, you see how the Romans might figure that this would be an event that they would need to put down. And the third, saying that Jesus is the Christ, a king. That would have perked up the ears of Rome too. If Jesus is coming and inciting the people, if he's going to get them to entice the nation not to pay taxes at all, not to be under the dominion of Rome, and if Jesus is their king, then you've got a real problem. And that's why the cohort was out there, ensuring that this didn't take place. Because this is not the first time that the Romans, I'm just kind of guessing here, this is probably not the first time that the Romans heard these charges. So this was something that certainly they were saying at the Sanhedrin, but it was something that Rome would have been well aware of as well, which would account for the 600 men to arrest one person. Why? Does that make sense? 600 men plus the Jews, temple guard and the Sanhedrin and all the Jewish leaders, all there to arrest one man. You just can't understand why that is unless you understand the charges that were brought before him at the Sanhedrin, which would have been addressed to Rome, because they were wanting to use Rome to fulfill their desire to have Jesus put to death. So they certainly would have said all this before Rome. And yeah, I read that. I was going to say any questions about this section? I mean, we're still in it, but yes, sir, JD.
Just to set the stage a little bit, I mean, isn't it like we know from history that essentially the Jews couldn't put anybody to death themselves? They had to have the permission of the Romans.
Yeah.
And in general, the Romans let people run their own religious affairs, and so they weren't interested in putting somebody to death for some religious matter they didn't care about. So
Yeah.
the Jewish leaders had to make it about something against Rome.
Yeah. And then they did it pretty effectively, apparently. I kind of combined question 5 and 6 What members of the Jewish, question 5, what did the Jewish council charge Jesus with? Ultimately, is blasphemy. And that's really what I think they were looking for there. Either Jesus who he claimed himself to be, or he was a blasphemer. And then what members of the Jewish council took Jesus to Pilate, and what did they accuse him of, and what were the charges of their accusation. So I kind of combined those two. So we'll get into question 7 now. Yes?
I thought it was interesting that he told him, this is your hour,
Yeah.
knowing that his hour was coming.
Your hour of darkness. Yeah. The power of darkness is yours. And this is it was Jesus' hour too. This was everything that the prophets had foretold would take place as now being culminated in the arrest and the death of Jesus. And so, yeah, and I think it's important, good point. I think it's important that he says, this hour of darkness is yours. He had prevented himself from being taken prematurely, because he had a lot more teaching to do. Remember when they wanted to take him and force him to be their king, and he slipped kind of through their midst, and so there was this, and then Jesus came in the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and they hailed him as the King of the Jews, the Messiah. And so he had prevented himself from being taken prematurely. Now he says the very things that they want to hear. Are you the Son of God then? Yeah, I am. Very pointedly in verse 69 and 70. Why did Pilate send Jesus to Herod? In verse 6. What's that? Yeah, that's true, but why? Yes, sir.
I believe he's really trying to pass the buck. He was seeing here this was a Jewish religious thing.
Yeah.
It was a highly charged thing, and basically charges was being trumped up against Jesus. This wasn't going to have a good outcome, and he really didn't want to have any of it laid at his feet. We see in one of the other accounts, his wife had called to him or sent him a message, said, "Don't have nothing to do with this just man. I suffer a lot of bad dreams about him tonight." So he was really wanting to get this off of his doorstep and let somebody else take the heat for it.
Yeah, exactly. I think both answers are good answers. I kind of slided past this one. Why did they change their accusation? And going back to verses 5 and 6 of 5, 6, and 7 of chapter 23, they changed their accusation to, he stirs up the people with his teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee. When Pilate heard that, he said, what am I to do with Jesus? I can't find anything wrong with him. You brought to me three capital punishment Roman charges against him. There's nothing there. What am I to do with this guy? From Galilee all the way to Jerusalem. So he is a Galilean. Send him to Herod. That's his jurisdiction. And next week we'll pick up with question 7. Thank you for your input and your questions and comments.